I'm going to talk today about style guide-driven development on a project that I've been working on at Pivotal Labs. How many people here have done test-driven development? Oh, awesome, so a whole bunch of you. Do you mind if you haven't done test-driven development raising your hand? I see a few, okay. So basically, and this is going to be my summary of test-driven development because from what I've seen so far, everybody that I've ever asked about it comes up with a different answer for exactly what it means. But the rough idea is how do you work incrementally and write tests that are going to figure out whether you're on the path to getting your code to do what you want it to do or not. And then how do you then later use those tests to make sure that your code still works when you make other changes. And that sounds fantastic, but sometimes it kind of works for CSS and other times it doesn't really. And so in my project, we came up with something called style guide-driven development, which I think the Pivotal Labs New York office actually sort of started using that term first, and I'm not even really sure where they got it. But it's been working out pretty well, so I want to tell you a little bit about it. So I'm going to talk about a few things. First, the goals, the challenges, our plan, how we executed on it, and the results that we got. I think it's super important to focus on results because if something's really the right approach, then it has good results. So our goal was to reskin the site to match some new branding. We had this site, which was, very heavy and was loading super slow, and in general, we weren't happy with it. There were a bunch of things that just weren't right, and the designers really wanted to change it too. These were the sort of intermediate designs we came up with. We had a two-phase project. The first one we called B flat because we knew that we weren't going to get to do a huge change in the way any of the UX worked. We just needed to flatten things out and get some of the excess UI stuff out of there. And then very shortly after, we did another redesign, which this is what we ended up with. Basically, we didn't know for sure that this would be such a different design when we were going through it, but and even still, the component system that we built and the style guide really helped us get through two major redesigns in something like 3 or 4 months. So the challenges, there were a lot of them actually. First, there was so much CSS, 91% of it unused on a standard page. It was like 314 KB uncompressed. It was not so much slowing the page down. I mean, that was part of it, but it was just really unwieldy to work with. We had custom CSS per view. It's a Rails app, and Rails really wants to encourage you to write CSS, a separate CSS file for every single view that you have in your app, and you kind of have to fight it to get it not to have you do that. So our CSS tended to be either deeply nested and specific, and so not reusable at all, or it was extremely global, almost impossible to know the scope and where it was used and what, in fact, you'd break if you changed any of it. We also had a problem with layout proliferation. Layouts in Rails are your sort of top-level templates that your starting points for your app. It seemed like for basically every single page, we had created a new starting point layout, even though they weren't actually substantially different. What tended to be different in them was actually the content area. And when we would make changes, we would quite frequently forget that we had another layout for some random page and end up with one of our layouts being broken because it wasn't up to date. We also kind of had partials inception. Someone on the team before we all started must have really loved creating partials. We had partials for things that weren't shared anywhere. We had like nested layers, like each partial would have like a line or two in it, and then it would point to another partial. A line or two, and it would point to another partial. You'd get like 12 deep before you could finally see anything about what was going on in your partial. We also had a sort of more buttons, more better philosophy. We had like 20 or 30 different kinds of buttons, different sizes. You couldn't even always see that they were different. They'd look like the same orange button, but actually they were, a pixel difference, or they looked exactly the same, but they were actually coded twice. And so you'd end up with extra images because, of course, everything was done with images. It didn't have any CSS3, so it's really hard to change. Designers would ask for what should be a simple thing, like, I'd like to update the button styles for the small green buttons, and we would give them estimates like, well, that'll probably take a week, which is just not the amount of time it should take to change a button style over. We also had jQuery soup, and a lot of it. Everything was these custom widgets and one-offs, set up on the page rather than reusable. We had like 6 different ways of toggling something, which just seemed a little bit crazy. We'd also put our frameworks in our assets file, which in Rails, that's where your own code is supposed to go, which meant that people felt like it was okay to change them because they're in assets. And so we end up with like all these different frameworks, all in assets and slightly modified from their original. So basically impossible to upgrade. We also had sort of epic stories that were sort of difficult to estimate. They'd give us a story that was along the lines of redesign the marketplace page. And we're like, yeah, that could be, that could be a few days or that could be a few weeks. It's super hard to tell how long that's going to take. We also had a crazy deadline constraint. We had about 6 weeks, and the design wasn't complete when we got started. Basically, our PM was supportive, but at the same time, he knew that we had to get the first version of the site out, and he basically said, I need to see some progress by January 1st, and if I don't, then I'm gonna have to call the project off, and we're gonna just have to reskin it, whatever we have to do, whatever crazy, terrible CSS we have to write. And I was like, no, please, give me time, we're gonna do it. Definitely didn't want to write more crazy on top of the crazy that we already had. So it was a little overwhelming. The constraints were pretty tough. So we started thinking about how to get there. We know what we wanted it to look like, but what we have was too fragile and brittle to really get there incrementally. So what did we want to do? We basically decided that we needed to build components and start using style guide-driven development to sort of rescue our project from the chaos that it had gotten into. I should mention as well, our velocity was really low. We were having trouble releasing features, which is something that happens to teams when they get into a place where their front-end code is really messy. It gets really hard to get something new out because you're having to work around all this legacy to get anything released. So components helped us structure the site, and now I'll give you a little demo. And this style guide is actually live on the web, so you can check it out. I will tweet out the link later, but it's at console.run.pivotal.io, and it's /styleguide. And we decided to build on top of Bootstrap, mainly because the product wasn't defined yet. We didn't know exactly what it was going to be or what it was for. The designers were still doing a lot of user testing and still figuring out, like, why would somebody use this? It's a tool for, the product that I work on is a tool for being able to scale cloud applications, adding instances and things like that, being able to check the health of your system and make sure that your apps are running well and that they, being able to change different setup of them live and on the cloud. And so it's a funny product to be working on because a lot of people who are going to want to change these things are going to be much more comfortable in a CLI than they are in a web app, and they're going to want to go to a CLI. So our designers were still doing a lot of research to figure out why would somebody use this over, over the CLI, over the tool that they're pretty comfortable with. And some of the things that we'd found out were people said they'd use it on mobile. So, what if I need to scale the app because I get an incident report on my mobile phone, I get an alert, but I don't actually have my computer with me. I could add instances or I could restart the app from my mobile phone. So that's some of the stuff that we're still figuring out what it's for. And so building on top of Bootstrap meant that we didn't have to know what we were doing ahead of time. We weren't making the most optimized system. We were trying to make a system that we could iterate with and then get better. So we have a whole bunch of different kinds of components in here, from alerts to app status. This is where you would stop or restart your app. Different kinds of things that we would use, all different sorts of buttons, fewer than we had before, which is fantastic. Our colors and things like that. So this may seem like a lot of colors, but we had way, way, way more before. So this is sort of continuing to constrain it down to sort of a more reasonable number. And different kinds of things, gravatars and grids and health indicators, all kinds of stuff. And we've since broken it up into different areas because we're having trouble finding things, but the categories aren't necessarily working that well because you still don't know where something's going to be. Anyway, so that's roughly how the style guide works. So, we might have progress bars or whatever else. So when somebody needs that, we actually use Haml for the most part. So they have a Haml example, exactly what they'd have to copy paste in order to get that into a particular page. And then we have the rendered versions of each of those. So the goal is to make it really super easy for people to use existing components, much easier than it is for them to make up their own stuff, basically. So here are some of the results, some of the numbers that we got. We had a lot fewer layouts. We moved from about 7 layouts to 2, which felt a lot better. We needed to have one simplified layout states so that we didn't have, we weren't dependent on having data available for our error states to render correctly, but still we were pretty happy with that change. We had 21 image requests before at 82 KB, down to 2 image requests at 21.9 KB. So pretty good improvement in image size. I think, frankly, we could go a little bit further, but we've got a little work to do in order to do that. Our CSS moved from 314 KB to 128. To me, that's still big. That's still a lot. But we're not at the point in our app where we're ready to be optimizing for like the high use case. We're right now still like figuring out what we are and what we're going to do and what we're building and why people use it and stuff like that. So that seems like a good middle ground for us right now. We also moved the compressed CSS from 44 KB down to 22. Yeah, still a little high, especially given that we don't have a mobile version of the site. The site's responsive and just works, well, as best we can, just works on mobile. So that means that, unfortunately, that much CSS getting sent over the wire is kind of high. Definitely something we're looking at for that inflection point when it'll be the moment where we should really start reducing that. And so we went from 90% unused CSS to 69%. The unfortunate thing is 53% of that comes from Bootstrap, which is a little bit tough. We don't want to modify the framework because that would make the upgrade path hard. But if we use the framework, we get a lot of stuff we don't want. And that's in spite of actually having pulled in all of Bootstrap, commented out all the @includes, and then uncommenting them as we use them. So we're not pulling in everything, just what we need, but any one Bootstrap file actually has quite a bit of stuff in it. And so, while we might not need, like maybe we only want regular progress bars and not animated progress bars, it all sort of comes lumped in together. So it's something we're thinking about and starting to contribute back to Bootstrap so that we can make it a little more granular. So how did we do it? That's a little bit of the results and how it turned out, but how did that happen? Our hypothesis was basically that components are hard and pages are relatively easier, and that components are actually a feature that should be validated when they're documented in our style guide. Faster design feedback meant that we'd had a better sense if we were going to make our release, if we were on the right track. We basically started having a story first that would be create X component and put it in the style guide. And that became really helpful because straight away, if we'd sort of built it wrong, the designer got a chance to see it before we were 8 miles deep into building a particular page. The PM got to validate that it fit with what he was expecting it to look like. We would also kind of skip a bunch of the fine-tuning of the animations and then do that in a final pass with the designer once it was in the style guide, but before it was on the page. And that worked out pretty well for us. So the result was smaller, more manageable stories, a much more predictable delivery, and our velocity shot up. I think the funny thing about when a team starts moving faster is that just moving faster in itself is super motivating. And when you get that motivation, like you're like, oh, we're getting work done, we're churning through things, all of a sudden it feels much more viable to be able to output a large volume of work. We also moved to Bootstrap 3 to take advantage of better support for modern browsers and some of the responsive stuff, which I found really cool. We had a dependency on something called Rails admin, which unfortunately wanted Bootstrap 2, which is super annoying, but we ended up being able to break that by only including that in the admin pages, which are not actually accessed by real users, and put it in the agenda to later build our own admin pages so that we wouldn't be dependent on that. We also used something called Hologram from Trulia for our style guide. And Susan Lin is in the audience today, and she worked with me at Trulia just before they actually created Hologram. So I had made a style guide generation tool in my company, and I thought it was awesome. It was so complicated, you wouldn't even believe it. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. This is the best style guide generator ever. And the moment I stopped working with Truly, they were very polite while I worked there, but the moment I stopped working with them, they switched away from that style guide tool immediately and built their own. And I was like, oh. But then I tried theirs, and it was actually fantastic. It was so much better than mine, you wouldn't believe. So then I switched over to theirs instead. It's a really great tool. It basically allows you to have Markdown in your CSS. So if you look up here, I know it's a little bit light to see. You basically have a Markdown comment doc, and it gives you the title, the name, and the category. And so based on the things that you put in there, and you can put tables in as well, and you can put your actual documentation in Markdown. Right near the CSS that it's actually documenting, which for us was a big key to actually keeping the two synced up. As long as those were in separate files, it was just too easy for them to get out of sync with each other. One cool thing you can do is also have a subcomponent. So here you have the same, the title, name, and category, though you could have skipped the category in this case because it has a parent panel. So it's a square panel, and it's a parent panel, and that allows us to do the nesting in the style guide automatically without needing to do any work to actually make that happen. We also found that the combination of this and Bootstrap 3, we're actually writing very, very little CSS, and yet having a pretty clean experience. The generated style guide is going to look something like this, with all of our different classes documented in the table, the modifier class that you need to make that happen there, and then underneath the rendered example and the Haml example. We've since taken on a larger scope, which is to be used by a bunch of projects that are actually not written in Rails. So now we're going to be used by a project in Java, a project in Go, and that's just to start with. So we're going to be fully front end, and we're going to basically break any dependence we have with any back-end languages. So I'm going to have to have HTML examples in there and full JavaScript rendering, which is sort of an interesting challenge. We'll see how that one goes. So what we found was that designers really work in a view-related world. They work on a page at a time or a flow at a time. They're really thinking page by page by page. And that needed to be translated for developer consumption. Like basically we needed it broken down into components, but they really needed to be thinking globally. And so we did a lot of sort of work on how to do that. So basically this is our marketplace page. And there are different sorts of services that you can add to your app databases and testing services and things like that, sort of standard things. And so the designer might look at this and sort of be thinking, of this as an entire page, an entire experience. But when we thought about it, we were thinking of it as little pieces. And so there was a lot of tension of whose job it was to actually break it down into component stories. One of our PMs felt like it really should be done by the designers, but they hadn't had experience in breaking something down into components, so that didn't quite work. And then, on the developer side, we wanted to take responsibility for it as well, but we weren't always aware of where the design was going and when it was ready to be broken down. So it kind of ended up being everybody's job. So we would start breaking something down. We would build, boxes, and we'd build a media block, and some of this existing in Bootstrap, some of it needing to be modified. We'd build headings and body copy and 3-column grids, getting them just right for us, making sure they have the right gutters and making sure that they lay out properly in the way that we need, that they're going to flow and change according to page size. So that ended up being a lot on me at first. I ended up doing a lot of the translation step and actually found it really hard to teach that to people. I would love suggestions if you guys have it for good ways to teach people to break down pages into components. Still not 100% sure, but I know that they're a lot better at it from pairing and working together doing it. They definitely are, several people are starting to be able to do that, and the designers started to talk about components once the page is done and the experience has been sort of crafted. Then the conversation turning to practical things has started to naturally turn to components, which is great. But still, I think we have a ways to go in that. So this is an example of a story that we would have in Pivotal Tracker, the tracking software that we use. But you could have it in any kind of tracking software. Like my company used to use GitHub Issues, and that works fine too. So basically create box components and document them in the style guide. So boxes, it says at the bottom, boxes only include borders, background should go on background components, and contents will be created separately. So this kind of instruction isn't necessary now, but in the beginning, it was really hard for people to tell from a mock-up which bit of the thing they were supposed to be building. And we had all these crazy sketches where people would outline in magenta the bit that was supposed to be built and try to X out the bit that wasn't supposed to be built. And now I think people just have a natural sense for it, but it was a little bit difficult in the beginning. And so then we would have examples of the different boxes, images of them uploaded to the bug, because no matter how you describe something, it's just much better to see it when you're building something visual. And that worked out pretty well. And then we'd create tasks sometimes for each of the kinds of boxes that we were going to build. And that helped just keep us sort of organized and see how much closer we were getting to being done. How many people here have seen me talk about object-oriented CSS at all? Okay, so a fair number, but not everybody. Forgive me a little bit. I kind of wanted to add a little detour into what makes a good component. Some of you, if you've seen me talk about OOCSS, are probably going to have seen this before, but I didn't want anybody to be left behind. So added about 10 slides of this, so let's get into it. So basically, if we think about building boxes, we have to figure out what is a good component and what makes a good component. How do you define how much do you put into it and how much do you break it into separate pieces? And this is something that I find, when you first get started in CSS or maybe in any language, because I find myself doing it in Ruby for sure, you really want rules. You want someone to tell you, like, X is the way to do this thing. And so people will ask me, should I make this into one component, or should I break it into two classes, or should it be one component and then a modifier? And often my answers are sort of like trade-offs, I'll say, okay, well, the positives of putting it all in one are that you would only have one class to apply and you get all that behavior. The negatives are if you want to use that separately from this, you really can't. You're going to have to make yet another new thing. And then talking about breaking it out, saying, well, would it make sense to a user to, for me, a user is a developer, sorry. Would it make sense to a developer who's using this system to know what those individual pieces mean? My sort of guideline on that side is not having anything that can't be shown and understood in a style guide. And the reason for that is, float left might feel like a really, really great class to have if you know how floats work and you know that you have to clear them and you know all the ins and outs of what might break if you float something. But I don't want to assume that the people using my style guide to build functionality know what a float means. I don't want them to have to think about the guts of how CSS works when they're interacting with it. So that's sort of the trade-offs that I kind of try to think of and try to walk them through. But it's hard, right? It turns out like nothing really replaces a smart developer making good decisions in a given situation. And I think that it's difficult. There are pros and cons on both sides. So a little bit of the anatomy of a good component. Let's look at an example from Facebook. This is basically a media block example. So it's an image on the left and stuff that describes it to the right. This is in the OOCSS open source project on GitHub. It's also in Bootstrap now, so you can check it out there as well. All of these are actually media blocks. They're all images with stuff that describes it to the left or to the right. They may look different. They may be different sizes and things like that, but they're the same object. So the first thing to think about when you're trying to figure out if something is a good component is to figure out, what do you know about it? Now with these, we know they can be nested, right? Because we've got a nested one over here with a little envelope inside of that particular media block. We know that they have an optional write button because that one also has a little X on it where you can close it away. We know it's got a clear fix because you don't want some content sort of running up inside of the media blocks that you already have on the page. But maybe a little bit more important is think about what we don't know about it. Because what we don't know about this object is where it's going to be flexible, where it's going to solve more than one problem rather than just the problem at hand. So what we'll notice is the image width and decoration vary. We don't have any idea how big the image is. In fact, it could be a movie. It could be anything. It could be video or other kind of content as long as it's fixed width. The right content's also unknown. In some cases, it's a list. In some cases, it's just a simple link. In some cases, it's fairly complex with links and lists and all sorts of things put in it. So we don't want to assume anything about what's going to be contained inside of this media block. And the other thing is that the width is unknown. So we've got one little one up there, but we've got another one that's really wide. Now, if we made this exactly 467 pixels wide, because that's how wide the sidebar happened to be in this particular iteration of a particular design, then you could only use that media block in a case where that was true, and that's going to be a really limited subset of times. So making the width be flexible is super important as well. We also want to separate structure from Chrome. In the top example, it's a little hard to see here. There's a blue background, and in the bottom example, there's a white background. We don't want to tie those things together, because then if we need to make a green one or whatever other color, we would basically have to rewrite all of the media block code, and we don't want to have to duplicate it. So it's a few lines of HTML. This is the OOCSS example rather than the Bootstrap example. They work basically the same. The class names are just a little bit different. And then it's just a few lines of CSS as well, really simple. On the media, there's a clear fix. In this case, it's an overflow hidden clear fix, but it really could be anything. I found out from talking to Nan at CSSConf AU that from Facebook that they're now using an overflow hidden clear fix. But there are several different ways that you could do it, and all of them, again, have positives and negatives, good things about them and things that are harder and that you'd have to work with. So then it's just some float left and float right and a little bit of margins to separate out your images from the content they're next to. So pretty simple all in all. And yet this is my Facebook stream. On the right-hand side, I've highlighted everywhere that they used a media block in order to lay out content. And I made it a partial opacity so you can see where it's darker red. That's basically where they're nesting media blocks inside of each other. So with just this one little component, it's pretty powerful. And you can actually do a whole bunch of different kinds of layouts just with this one thing. I think of it as one of the most fundamental building blocks of the web, because almost every site or app that I've worked on has one of these. The Facebook HTML size reduced by about 50% when they were working on this. It's kind of interesting because a lot of people will say to me, oh, but you're going to have a lot of class names and your HTML size is going to go up. But consistently with the different clients I've worked with, HTML size actually goes down. I think the reason is that, sure, you may have a case that's super optimized where you have like, oh, I only needed one link and I was able to put the icon in as a background image, so you only had to have that one node in order to do it. But the truth is that usually if you have multiple ways of coding the same component over and over, some may be coded really well, and some may be coded by a backend developer who would really rather not be writing any CSS at all, and who knows how they'll end up doing it or how many nodes they'll add. So my feeling is that overall the size reduces because the consistency increases. But that's sort of me making up a story around it. All I really know numbers-wise is that it does reduce when you componentize. So what makes a good component? Correct granularity is really, really important. How do you solve only one problem and solve it well? And which problem are you going to have solved by this component? Which things aren't you going to try and make it do? Flexibility. What don't you know? Particularly width and height. You want to let content control your height and grids control your width rather than having individual components have sizes. You want to keep your specificity low. If you want to be able to combine components, it's really important to have low specificity so they're not constantly overriding each other. Encapsulation is important too. Which nodes actually belong to this media block and which are just, they happen to be children, but they're not a part of the media block itself. And modularity and predictability as well. The media block shouldn't behave differently just because you put it into a different column or you put it into a different page. Developers won't trust your code if they think that something may not behave the same way on different parts of the site. So here's the tile panel that we built and the designs for it. It was sort of interesting. I think it's typical of designs in Illustrator. When we got it from the designer, we noticed that the icon and the text was always centered, even when the footer showed and didn't show on hover. And we at first said, oh goodness, like how are we going to do that? And we at first tried not to, but it looked really bad. You had a big gap under there when the footer wasn't showing. Then we made it like a Plinko board where it just showed on hover like, really fast. And that didn't work either. So iterating with the designer, we were able to come up with an animation that showed the footer slowly. It faded in and faded out, and the content rose up and rose down along with it. Something like a 300 millisecond animation. And so by working with them and actually having them sit down and do design dev pairing, we were able to get something that felt like it worked pretty well, but without having to have it specified to the nth degree. I really hate the Illustrator with the red line marks on it that say exactly how many pixels should be between this thing and that thing. It drives me crazy. I don't think that we always know that, and I think it's really hard to keep it consistent across pages. There's no way to do a diff of an Illustrator file and to figure out that, oh, whoops, we used a slightly larger heading in this one, or we've added an extra pixel or two of space below this guy. So I think it's much more important to define the default spacing for the components and then put them together and let them sort of deal with themselves. So we then did a sort of visual acceptance of the components. So in the style guide context, the PM and the design took time to review, and independent of the individual page it was used on. This felt really good to us because we were struggling when we tried to do views-based CSS with ending up calling things really specific stuff. Like it would be like the marketing footer and things like that. And then we'd end up using it on another page, and it started to feel weird because it wasn't a marketing page anymore. They just happen to want to have the same footer. So doing that acceptance independently helped us write cleaner, more generic code. So we converted the marketing page first, mainly because it got designed first, and it was a little more concrete, and mainly because, as well, all the components for that page got done first. We really wanted to start converting pages as soon as possible because we were afraid the PM would pull the plug on the project if we took too long. So we wanted him to start to see progress and to see that we were getting somewhere. So we basically then had a story. Once we'd done the stories for all the components for that page, we had another story which was implement the marketplace page design with components. It was quite cool to get a story like this because once we had all the components together, it was like hooking up Legos. And we would put all the components together in basically a plain HTML or plain HAML document with lorem ipsum in it. And then we separated out actually hooking up the back end and hooking up the data side of things. And doing that again in 2 steps helped it to be faster and cleaner, especially for the developers who weren't as familiar with component systems. They got a chance to just figure out components, not have to do that along with figuring out hooking up the data. And from my side, where I'm less familiar with back end, it was great because I got to do the hooking up the data side without having to also think about whether I'd properly indented my panel and that kind of stuff. All that was solved ahead of time. We had feature flags for all of this so that we could still regularly deploy. Usually we like to do incremental deploys, but in this case it was just such a big change that we couldn't have one page of the site be green and another page of the site or all the other pages be blue. So we decided to feature flag the whole thing and do one big giant deploy. So we're sort of considering that incremental release or the big bang approach. And I like incremental releases. I think it's a lot easier to be sure you're not doing something crazy your users are going to hate. But in this case, it wouldn't work for us with the constraints of time that we had. So the thing that we were trying to do more than anything was to make an unsightly clean spot. And this is something that a friend of mine came up with years ago when he loved to restore old cars. And he would talk about when he'd gotten a really junky old car and he would clean part of it and how just cleaning that part made such a contrast so that you could actually see how dirty and how much attention and time other parts of the antique car needed to bring it up to restored condition. And so we kind of did that with our site. We had some pretty messy code. It felt pretty overwhelming, and a bunch of people had sort of tried to start getting things cleaner, and no one had gotten traction. Our velocity was super low, and we just weren't getting things done. And so then we decided the unsightly clean spot approach. We weren't going to try to get everything better. We were just going to focus on getting the front-end code better, just going to focus on components, and we were going to completely ignore the Ruby for a while. And once we did that and we actually made an unsightly clean spot, we could see, oh wow, the Ruby, our endpoints are not working for us because we actually need this in the front end and we're not getting it in the way that we need. So I think it's actually a pretty good way of starting to clean up a messy code base. Is don't try to spread your refactoring around the entire code base evenly. Focus it on one bit and really get that bit making sense. I think, at least for us, that worked really well. I'm going to skip that bit. So when converting a page, first we created the layout with the static components, and then second we wired up the page to the back-end dynamic content. So we would end up with something like this, where we had HAML, but it was all basically first lorem ipsum, and then we would actually hook it up to our endpoints and get our service offering names and descriptions and things like that. Once we finally had put together everything, so we had all the components, we had the page done with components, and then we had all the data hooked up. Then we did another stage of acceptance where our PM would look at the actual page and test all the flows and make sure they made sense. As well, it would give design a chance to look at the entire page in its context and make sure that the decisions we'd made in the microcosm of a particular component actually made sense when they were blown up to a page level. Design dev pairing was amazing for this. We got to do refinements, we got to do animation timing and interactions. It just wasn't possible to communicate that in static mockups. Adobe products are really tough for anything where you want to communicate about how something changes over time or anything like that. So we found that it was much better to do a rough version in pure HTML with just some basic design feedback and then actually sit with the designer and do it together. And then we discovered our designer could code as well, which was a fantastic thing to find out. Now we're making him code all the time. So we also did color and spacing tweaks when they didn't match the mockups. So sometimes he'd do things like change the background color when, normal iterations, right? He'd used a pretty dark gray, kind of a battleship gray for our background, and it really looked cool, but in a bunch of cases with different content, it didn't work very well. So slowly over time, he'd lightened it in the mockups, but we didn't realize. So in design dev pairing, he would pick up things like that and say, oh, you didn't notice I had lightened this, we need to change the gray that's the background of our page. And so more sort of mushy results, like less numbers-based, but I think just as important, if not more important. We now have no view-specific CSS at all. It's completely gone. Making changes to the CSS isn't terrifying anymore. I mean, I have like 10 years or 13 years of experience writing CSS, and the CSS that we had in the beginning, I didn't dare change it. I felt like I was gonna break everything if I touched it anywhere. Never mind people who were just getting out of college or who had done back-end and hadn't done a lot of front-end. It was really rough. And so now, changing our CSS, you know exactly what's gonna change as a result. The scope is a lot easier to determine. All of the components are in the style guide, which in terms of a testing strategy has worked out really well. It means that when we add a new component, we can check the style guide rather than having to check every page of the entire site. And that has been really super in terms of having us spend less time on testing and more time actually getting features out there. Way fewer partials. It's possible to actually tell what's going on in a page because we made sensible partials. When something was reused, we made it into a partial. When it wasn't, we didn't. And that's been pretty helpful. We got rid of jQuery UI and Bootstrap 2, which was fantastic. I think one framework is enough for anybody, and we did not need to have so many hanging around. And more importantly, maybe for the user, the design is consistent. And now when the designer wants to change something, like he just came up with a new design for all of the buttons, we can do that, and we can do that quickly. That's now an hour story instead of a multi-day or possibly week story. So before, when people were starting a new story, the question they were asking themselves was, what markup in CSS do I need to write? Now when they're starting a new story, they say, which components is this page made of? And that's a really fantastic change. That's made a huge difference in terms of how we work together and how much fun we're having building things. Not wasting time reinventing the wheel, but instead spending our time making the stuff that's really gonna make the product different and innovative and building the new thing instead of building the old things over and over. Thank you so much.